some work that we're doing with a hospital here in the NHS that's local, and some of the troubles that we've sort of come against. So I don't think I need to spend too long talking about the problems that we have in the UK with A&E. We've seen this, particularly since the pandemic, this decline in patient satisfaction, increasing waiting times, mayhem like in the bottom right. And what I'm not trying to do here is tell you why more people might be going to hospital. What we're looking at really is when people are in hospital, how long they're staying for. Are there any bottlenecks? Is there something that we can say about that? So this is the complexity of a standard NHS A&E system. The green is sort of entry. So we've got ambulances, walk-ins, and then the important part is triage, which is when you go and see a nurse. They will try and get an idea for what you may need. And then there's an assessment period and a treatment period. And then you've got your destination, whether that is into the hospital, if it's to go home. There's multiple ways that could be going on there. So we've got a very complicated system, and you could go between being an ED, which is typically when we think about A&E, we're probably thinking about the ED where you've lost an arm or something. Not that I hope that happens to people, but that's where you typically go. And then you've got this UTC, which is the urgent treatment center, and this is more like you've broken a finger, right? So you need treatment, but it's not life critical. And you can see that some people will go to either and they can be transferred. So this is a very complicated system. And as a mathematician, I don't want to do this. I'm going to reduce this down into one part. And that's what we're going to look at today. So queuing theory in general is this nice part of mathematics, and I won't spend too much time on it. But what you've got to think about is when you're in a queue, what's important? So who's arriving and how are they arriving? Are they coming as a group? Are they coming individually? How often are they coming? And that's something we need to infer. Who's serving? So how many queues do you have in tandem? Is it like a bank where there's multiple tellers? Do you have one person? And that's important to tell you how often people are getting through the system. Then there's discipline, which is when I'm in the queue, am I, like in a traffic jam, swapping between lanes? Am I staying in my lane? And I just leaving? And leaving in the context of hospital is a bit morbid because that actually means death. So am I dying in the queue? And then you've got discipline, which is first come, first serve, or priority. As we know, there's definitely a priority system in A&E. That makes my life really difficult, so I'm not going to think about it. So we will consider, as most literature, it's first come, first serve. The QR code, which I hope is working, I didn't check, but if it is, this will take you to a small dashboard that I built for the NHS so they can have a look at some literature and see like some simulation studies about what a queue might look like and some interesting results that you might obtain. So for the purposes of this, I'm really condensing what I can do. So I'm saying that there's always at least one person in the queue, which seems like it may not be true, but unfortunately it is. There's always, at least in the data sets we looked at least one person waiting to be served. I'm making an assumption that all of the servers are the same. They all have the same service rates, and there is multiple servers, but no tandem. It's just one and one out. And this is what I'm going to call an average queuing system, and it's important for narrative-wise, and I'll come back to it later. I'm not thinking about any sort of discipline. It's just the moment if you arrive, you're in the queue, and that's it. And then we're looking at first come, first served. A lot of these things will definitely be work in progress coming later, but for now, we're trying to take supposedly the easiest way in. So here's what would be ideal. If we know when a patient arrives, when they're about to be served, and served here, let's think about treatment. So when they're about to be sent for treatment, once they've finished treatment, and when they're ready to leave, that would be what's ideal. And so what we can do is we can look at the patients and how often they're arriving to determine what an inter-arrival time would look like, and that would give us a probability distribution. We can do the same thing for departure, and also for the service time to get the average length of service, and that gives us a probability distribution to model. And then you would like to think we could use something like a rota to be able to determine the number of servers that we have. Now, unfortunately, that's not the case. And if you've been to an A&E system, what you'll see is you'll have a group of people around you, you'll be put somewhere and then left, right? And they'll be doing other things. So what you need in a queuing system is a one-to-one relationship between server and customer. Customer not in the sense of Americans in the room, but it's like a one-to-one relationship. And that's not what you have in A&E. So really what we're looking at is something like service capacity. So how many parallel patients can be in the A&E at one time, given a certain number of doctors, which is a bit more tricky to think about. So what do we have? We have arrival and we have departure, and that's it. And we have 1 month's worth of NHS data, which is about 8,000 patients hospitalised, which is actually a reasonable amount of data. Apart from that, each hour, there's different arrival and departure rates, so there's not as much as we would think. So what we've done is we found a non-UK hospital data set, which has significantly more data that we're going to try and do some analysis on to see if we can run it in the NHS. But we still don't have the time of service, and that's the crux, because that would tell us how to get this capacity. So what the plan is to try and use mathematical modelling to determine or estimate the number of servers. And the algorithm we came up with sort of works like the following. So here's my queue on the right. I've got my people with hats so you can see who's who. And if there's one person and there's one server, what happens is the service time is either their arrival time, if someone is free, or it's the previous departure time, right? So once someone has left, that means someone is automatically free, and if there's someone in the queue, they will be ready to be served, right? So we can reconstruct the service time by using an ordering of when the patients arrive. Now, this sometimes falls apart, because if we assume that there is only one server, you can have situations where someone has left before they've been served, right? Which is obviously non-feasible, and so we've then got a little bit of uncertainty in our estimates. But that's okay, because all we can do is just assume that therefore there's 2 servers and it can correct itself. So this algorithm here is to try and determine what's the appropriate number of servers, and that's what we're going to go with. So I've lost a slide. Fantastic news. I had a simulation to show you. Oh, I'm actually on time. So let's end it there. So work in progress. Like I said, we want to extend this to time dependent. So what I will demonstrate if I have the time is that this works very well if you have a lot of data at any one period of time. But when you've got time dependence, the matching of the server to the patient becomes quite tricky, because if you have a change in the service capacity, somehow that either opens up or removes capacity, and there's a little bit of problems that goes over. But maybe something about what we're going to use this for, like optimizing some sort of rota arrangement. So if we've got this idea of capacity, maybe we can think about rotoring. Can we help that? Because it's very static as far as I understand. What would an impact in the reduction of service do if we were to remove capacity? How would that impact? I'm not going to talk about the structure, but essentially what happens if you split up some of those services or redefine how your system works? How will that improve things? And then a question on the floor that a lot of people are interested in is, if my queue is currently at 20 patients, what's the probability that we go above some threshold at this period of time? Because this can be a decision maker to say, we need to get in some more staff. So on that, thank you for listening, and here's all the potential, like the contributions that we've got going on. And finally, I would like to thank the university and Discus in particular for the support of the financial support that's been going on, and the modelling cell, which is the group of people that I work with for all this support. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, James. You wouldn't like to do a sort of interpretive dance of the simulation or express it in some other way?
There we go. I found it. So basically here, the situation that I told you I was going over. The situation's like this. In the first one, I'm assuming that there are 3 servers. That's what I ran with the simulation. You can see at the top. If you use 2 servers, you can see the duration sometimes go below 0, right? Which means it's infeasible. And because we've made some assumptions about the queue, it means that this histogram should become an exponential distribution. And the way that we're going to say this is the number of servers that we think is appropriate is by checking whether the histogram is close enough to an exponential distribution. And as you can see, 3 looks about right, 5 starts to look off, and that's essentially because the time of service is becoming longer because actually they're meant to be queuing for longer. And this is what it looks like when you have more data. So if you run it for 100 time points, you end up seeing that there is some amount of uncertainty about how you obtain this, but the more data you use, the more it becomes that you're going to actually end up somewhere. So there you go. There's my dance. All right.
Very good. Thank you. Any questions for James?
Thank you. Very interesting. Well, first, we know we need more doctors and nurses, right? So I guess we can answer that straight away. But my point is that there's a lot of assumptions in what you're doing, right? And none of them, to me, I've been to the A&E more than once. None of them look realistic, to be honest. So I think you need to consider that people will need to go to the A&E for different reasons. They will need to be there for different periods of time. So I would recommend maybe adding complexity to your model, because otherwise you will always end up with an exponential, right? If you find anything that is kind of a flux of people arriving at some barrier, which is the A&E kind of reception, there will eventually be an exponential decay of your population, right?
That's true, yeah, and we see that experimentally as well. You can see in the data that you do get exponential pretty much when you have enough data. The reason that we're starting here is because no one's done this before. And it seems unwise to work with the NHS and say, we're going to solve all these problems for you without having a real good understanding about what's going on. But I absolutely agree to your point that this is way too simplified for any practical use, but we're hoping to get there when we can.